Welcome back to another B.Hooked crochet video tutorial. I'm your host Brittany, and in this lesson I'm going to demonstrate how to make a pom-pom just like this using only your hands. Now you can buy palm makers, and I'm sure that makes life a lot easier and probably a little less messy, but there's really no need to buy a palm maker. You can actually make it with just your hands, some yarn, and all you need are a pair of scissors. Poms can be made out of many types of yarn, but for this video I'm going to demonstrate using a worsted weight yarn. It's exactly what you see here. Now this is Red Heart Super Saver, which I find to be really good to make poms with, just because it's an acrylic yarn and it's really sturdy. So you're actually going to have to pull the tension that holds this whole thing together pretty tight, and so that makes Red Heart Super Saver a perfect candidate. Now this is just some scrap yarn that I had left over from a previous project, so you don't really need too much. I wouldn't go out and buy a brand new skein just to make poms unless you're looking for a specific color that you don't already have. I think you're going to be surprised at how easy this is. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is the size that you're making, especially if you're putting this on a hat or if you need two. You do want to keep track of the size so that way they're both pretty uniform. Now all you have to remember is basically the size. Well, we'll look at it this way. The amount of fingers you're wrapping it around is going to determine the size, as well as how many times you wrap it around. Those are the two things that you need to keep in mind and that you need to remember if you're going to be making multiples and you want them to be the same size. Okay, that being said, now it really is just as simple as this. Now this pom is, I don't know, probably 2.5 inches or so in diameter, and I'm going to try to duplicate this same size. And the way I made this one was I wrapped it around my 4 fingers. Now everybody's going to be a little bit different because our hands are different sizes, but just keep in mind that if you're wanting to make a really small pom, you maybe want to wrap it around 3 fingers or 2 fingers, and if you're wanting to make a really large one, you may make a fist, you know, hold on to it, make a fist, make your hand as big as possible and wrap it around that way. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to wrap it around my 4 fingers just like this. And so I'm just going to secure the tail under my thumb here for the first couple of wraps, and then after that the tension on it is going to hold it in place and we don't have to worry about this tail coming unraveled. So basically just start wrapping. I mean, that's really all there is to it. Now you want to try to keep your tension as steady as possible because you want the loops to all be roughly the same size, and I'll kind of explain why later and it will probably become pretty apparent. But just go ahead and wrap as many times as you would like. Now if you're getting really technical with this, you may actually even count the number of wraps if you're wanting your poms to be exactly the same size. However, that's not totally necessary. You can, as long as you get it pretty close to the same size, then you can kind of compensate with trimming it up so you don't have to get it precise. But you know, there's a time and a place for that. So I wrapped this around, and I didn't count how many times I wrapped the first one because, like I said, for my purposes I don't need them to be exactly the same size. So I'm just going to keep wrapping as many times as I think looks good, and just know that the number of times that you wrap is going to be how full your pom ends up being. Okay, so if you're wanting kind of a thinner pom-pom, you may not wrap it as many times, but if you're wanting a pretty full one like this, then you do want to wrap it around a considerable amount of times, and just keep it on your fingers. Sometimes it has a tendency to want to slide off. So you don't want to wrap it so tight that you can't pull it off of your hand, but you don't want to wrap it so loose that it falls off. So I think this is about good. This is about the amount that I wrapped on the first one. Okay, so once you get to the point where you think, okay, that's probably gonna make a nice size pom. Now that I say that, I'm gonna wrap a few more times. Okay, so when you get it to where you want, go ahead and cut your end. And it doesn't really matter where you cut it. I cut it so it's about the same length as the bottom there. You can kind of see it there. Okay, and then gently slide this off of your fingers. Now, depending on the type of yarn that you're working with, you may want to hold on to this. But one of the things that I love about making poms out of Red Heart Super Saver is the fibers, since they're so rough, they kind of stick together. So I can just put this down and it's not going to come unraveled. Now the next step that we want to do is we want to take our some more yarn and we want to cut a strand that is roughly, we'll say 10 inches or so. Okay, and this is going to serve as the center, and like basically it's going to be the piece of yarn that holds everything together. So I'm just going to lay this down flat, and roughly in the center of the strand that I cut, I'm going to place the pom that I've created. And now when I say roughly in the center, try to get it as exact as possible, because this is going to be the center point for your pom-pom. And if it's a little bit crooked, like if it's too far this way or too far that way, then your pom is going to be less stable and it might fall apart on you, which is not what you want if you're making this for like a child's hat or something that's going to get a lot of use. So once you get it in the center, you're just going to tie a knot, and now you're going to pull this as tight as you possibly can. That's important, okay? You want to pull it as tight as you can without breaking your yarn. So this is going to be where knowing your yarn is really going to come into play. Like I said, Red Heart Super Saver is so durable. I know that I can put a lot of tension on this and not break my yarn. But if you're using a softer yarn, or especially a natural fiber yarn, you're probably not going to want to pull as tight. Now I like to if I'm doing this by myself, now you can get a helper to hold on to your knot, but I just kind of take one of my other fingers and put pressure on it so I hold the knot in place. And I want to make another knot and still keep tension on it, just like that. So now this is pretty secure, and as you can see, I've got my knot tight enough so that it pulls everything in together. And now, just for security's sake, I'm gonna knot this one more time. Not that it's gonna go anywhere, but it makes me feel better. And I'm gonna hold on to these ends, okay? And later on, if you are gonna be sewing this onto a project, like a hat or something like that, you can use these ends to do just that. You can weave them in, or you can tie them on, depending on what type of project you're working on, okay? And if that's not the case, if you're just making a pom-pom just by itself and you don't want any stragglers, go ahead and keep this part on, because you're going to need something to hold on to when we're shaping this. It's going to make things a little easier. Okay, we might be tempted to just go ahead and stick our scissors in and just cut this in one big piece, but that's actually not the best way to do it. You want to try to cut each of the loops at the midpoint. So basically I've got my scissors in here, I'm pulling all the way up, so I've reached about the center. But now if you were to just do one at a time, it would take you ages, especially if you're making a really thick pom. So I try to find a happy medium. Typically you've got a group here at the end that won't really cooperate. It kind of sticks out differently. You know, it doesn't wrap nice and smooth like it does here. They kind of stick out. So I'll trim those up first, and then I'll go through the top layer and I'll cut, you know, as close to the middle as I possibly can. And I'll work my way all the way down. And then just keep going. So once you slide your scissors in, pull up on it. Make sure that you've got the loop pulled as high as possible. And if you've got to cut a couple by themselves, that's okay. Now, since we've cut those first loops, now we've opened up basically the second layer here. So we're just going to work through all of these loops. We want to make sure we cut every single one of them, because as you've probably guessed, the loops are what is going to create your fuzzy pom effect. So you're going to have to kind of play around, make sure you get all the loops on one side, and then we'll work over into the other side. So I think I've pretty much got everything on this side. So now I'm just going to flip it over, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to put my scissors in and start working my way through. Okay, so I've got my first layer there. Now you can see the underneath side. So we're going to go ahead and trim these up. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet, and you have probably figured out, is that this is incredibly messy. Especially like me, I'm working with these acrylic fibers, and it just goes all over the place. So I would highly recommend, for the sake of your allergies if you have them, or if you're working on your couch or whatnot, I would recommend doing this over a garbage can. I'm not doing that here for this film, but you'll find that it gets pretty messy, and it's just so much easier if you're working over a garbage can or even like a scrap piece of paper, and that way you can just pick up the piece of paper and toss it in the trash. So that is a very important side note that you will definitely want to know when making this. So once you get all of your strands cut from the other side, I just kind of go through again and make sure I don't see any loops. And then I kind of like to fluff it up a little bit, because if you don't, you can kind of see where the center strand is holding it together. It has a tendency to want to part on you, so I just kind of fluff it up with my fingers. And as you do this, this is when all the fibers are going to start falling. Now, you can probably see them in the video, like on the paper. So that would all end up in your lap or on your couch, as I made the first mistake of doing this. I did it on my couch and it was a huge mess. So now from here, the fun part begins. We don't really want to leave it like this, and for good reason. It doesn't really look like it's complete, and it's a little straggly, so it needs a haircut. Now, there's really no perfect way to do this. I don't put a whole lot of thought into it. I just start cutting. And you know, you want to watch out that you don't cut it too short. You want to have in mind roughly the size that you want your finished pom to be. And you want to try not to cut the strands shorter than that, obviously. But I just pick a little section, get them all roughly the same length, and then move on to the next section and just kind of work my way around. I tend to take off less initially. That way I can, you know, I can always cut off more later. But if you cut it too short, you're gonna run the risk of it falling apart, or you'll see the center strand, which is definitely not desirable in most cases. So now I'm still holding on to my tail strands, okay? Like I said, you probably won't want to cut those off because you're gonna need them to tie it on. So I just kind of hold it between my ring finger and my pinky, just as if I were crocheting. That's kind of what I do. And then I basically just secure my fingers up at the base, and that kind of gives me some good leverage to work with it. So you'll probably find what's comfortable for you, and you may hold it a completely different way than I do, and that is perfectly fine. We're just looking for the end result, and here what we want is a nice uniform pom with roughly the same size strands. Okay, and this part's going to take you a little bit of time, especially depending on how particular you are about it. You can get pretty detailed with it. And what I like to do once I've been cutting for a while, like I said before, just kind of fluff it up a little bit. That'll loosen up the strands that might be folded. Even now, this isn't going to show up very well on camera, but shaking it is actually a good way to get it to fluff up. Now, you can see on mine, I've been cutting a lot in this area, so I need to focus my attention over here. Okay, so I think I'm just about finished with this. I'm just going to give it a once over, kind of fluff it up a little bit. And it's looking pretty good. Now for the purpose of this video, it's perfectly fine, so I'm just going to scoot all of this mess aside. And holding them side by side, they're pretty close. So I could embellish a hat with this, and I think it would do just fine. But like I said, if you need to do a little bit of extra trimming, then you can absolutely do that. Thank you for joining me in this tutorial of how to make yarn pom-poms using only your hands. You can get as creative as you'd like with these things, and share your work with me, share your ideas. I'd love to see it. On behalf of BHookedCrochet.com, I'm your host Brittany, and we'll see you next time.